welcome. Thanks so much for braving the snow and the flames game and so on. I expect we'll have people sort of coming in for the next 10 or 15 minutes because of the traffic, but hopefully it won't be too disruptive. So welcome to the 5th annual Naomi Lacey Memorial Lecture. I'm especially pleased to welcome all of you and members of the Lacey family to what has become one of the most anticipated evenings in the Calgary Institute for the Humanities year. My name is Jim Ellis, and I'm the director of the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. We are Canada's oldest humanities institute, founded in 1976 at the University of Calgary to support high-level humanities research and to promote the values of that research to the broader communities that the university serves. And the Lacey Resident Fellowship and Lecture serve both of those two aims. So we at the University of Calgary acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, the Bearspaw, and the Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Tonight's lecture is the most visible part of a program that is funded by the John and Naomi Lacey Foundation for the Arts. Each year, an outstanding scholar from the University of Calgary is selected to be the Naomi Lacey Resident Fellow. They're given an office at the Calgary Institute, they're given some time off from their teaching, and they're put into the community of other high-level scholars of an interdisciplinary nature. It's meant to encourage conversation across disciplines and to give people time to pursue their research, broadening the scope of conversation both at the university and beyond. So their one obligation is to give this public lecture. But I think the program is special because it doesn't just fund this lecture, it helps to fund the research behind it. And I think this makes it a fitting memorial to the person that the lecture honors. While she's probably more known in Calgary for her community leadership and philanthropy, Naomi Lacey was herself a researcher and teacher of the classics at the University of Calgary, specializing in the work of the Roman poet Ovid, and in particular, the art of love. But she was also an active member of the Advisory Council of the Calgary Institute for the Humanities, which is another reason why it's appropriate for this fellowship to honor her. And I think it's a very nice coincidence that tonight's lecturer comes from the Department of Classics and Religion, where Naomi taught. This is just one of the many worthy endeavors funded by John and Naomi Lacey, who have given very generously to the arts here in the city and indeed across the country. They're probably most known for their work with the Calgary Philharmonic Orchestra, but they've also been supportive of many other organizations in the city and beyond, including the National Gallery in Ottawa. And in recognition of this very distinguished record of community support, Dr. John Lacey was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Calgary a few years ago. And so it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Lacey, who will say a couple of words.
Thank you very much indeed, Jim, for that introduction. It always gives me enormous pleasure when we have these memorial lecture. It's so much what Naomi would have loved. She loved the university. There was no effort or job at the university she was not willing to undertake. She worked in the faculty's council. She worked with the Senate. She just loved the university. Jim has been arranging a program here. Surprisingly, it was 5. I was trying to work it out myself. And the years go by very, very quickly. But I am particularly looking forward to Dr. Muessig's lecture tonight. They're always a surprise what comes out. So I'm going to look forward very much to Dr. Muessig tonight. So with that, I want you just, when you're listening to the lecture, to think of Naomi behind it saying, go for it, because that's what she would have. And Jim, thank you very much indeed.
And thank you so much, John. We do aim to surprise here at the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I do want to tell you about a couple of our upcoming events that you might have seen flashed up here. In about a month, on Thursday, April the 30th, the celebrated feminist philosopher Kate Mann will be giving the second distinguished lecture in applied ethics. You may know her from her groundbreaking work called Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny. She'll be giving a lecture called Demoralizing Fatness, which will explore how obesity has become a moral condition in our society. About a month after that is our 43rd annual community seminar, which will happen April 28th here at the Central Library again. The topic is the insect apocalypse, which has as its starting point the alarming decline in insect populations around the world. But we'll be inviting speakers to think about how insects have figured in art and literature and so on, to think about how we have thought about insects and perhaps how we might think about them differently. So to receive information about these or any other of the approximately 30 events we do through the year, please do contact us, sign up for our newsletter. You can email us at cih@ucalgary.ca. And finally, although tonight's lecture was made possible by the generosity of the John and Naomi Lacey Foundation for the Arts, and also the reception that will follow tonight, which has been generously provided by John, I do want to thank some of the other donors who make all of our events possible. Judy McLaughlin and the McLaughlin Family Fund, the Palmer Family Foundation, Rod and Betty Wade, and many others. The university's Giving Day campaign is coming up in a few weeks. I'd be slapped if I didn't mention that, where all donations to the university will be matched up to $2,500. So please do consider joining us in our mission of promoting humanities research to the broader community. So now, finally, and hopefully everybody's here by now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Carolyn Muessig, this year's Naomi Lacey Resident Fellow. Dr. Muessig is a distinguished scholar of medieval religious thought and practice, and the chair of Christian thought in the Department of Classics and Religion at the University of Calgary since 2020. Prior to that, she was professor of medieval religion at the University of Bristol, where she was also director of the Humanities Institute there. So she's well at home at our Humanities Institute. She's the author of many articles and books, including most recently, Stigmata in Medieval and Early Modern Europe, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. So tonight's lecture comes from the work she's doing in her year as Naomi Lacey Fellow. That larger project is called Breaking the Glass Pulpit, Women Preachers in an Age of Silence, which looks at the various nuns and lay women who undertook to preach in somewhat difficult times. Please welcome Dr. Carolyn Muessig.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Jim. And I'm honored to be invited to give the Naomi Lacey Memorial Lecture this evening. I wanted to thank the Lacey Foundation for the Arts for their generous support of the humanities at the University of Calgary. I am grateful to the director of the Calgary Institute for the Humanities, Dr. Jim Ellis, who has created a wonderfully inviting atmosphere at the Institute. It's such an engaging environment to be at the CIH, and it is an absolute privilege to be a fellow at the oldest institute of the humanities in Canada. The work the CIH does in nurturing intellectual exchange and showcasing the arts and humanities is exhilarating and invaluable. And I want to thank Sean Lindsay, the CIH coordinator, in the organization of this event and in all he does in supporting the fellows at the CIH. And I want to thank all of you who are here tonight for braving the weather. Thank you so much. I know it took a lot to get here. It took a lot for me to get here too. I was going to watch it online, but I thought that would be a problem. So, and I'd like to thank those who are watching in person, online as well. So what I'd like to do is to start out with just some contextual points. Can you hear me okay? Yep. So first, to get our bearings, when I speak of the Middle Ages, I am referring to the 12th to the 16th century CE. So the late Middle Ages, some of you may think the very late Middle Ages as well. The geographical area I will be considering will be Western Europe. So we're looking at medieval Western Europe. And the women I'm discussing either lived well before the Protestant reformer Martin Luther came on the scene. So therefore, or were there just when he appeared. So therefore, the Christianity analyzed tonight will be Roman Catholic. So Christianity and Roman Catholicism within its Western medieval European context. So let me explain this image too, because it's been on the wonderful publicity that Sean has put together. But what it is, it's an image of Mary Magdalene preaching. And this is a tradition that started in basically in the 12th century in Western Europe, that after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, Mary Magdalene went to France, southern France, and she went there to convert the Gauls to Christianity. And so a legend developed that Mary Magdalene was one of the great preachers who brought Western Europe to Christianity. And so this is a fabulous depiction of that image. It's from the early 16th century of Mary Magdalene preaching to the masses to convert them to Christianity at a pulpit. So let me see, yeah, the pulpit, which is, you're gonna see it's not usual to find a woman in a pulpit. So now I also want to address very quickly misconceptions about the Middle Ages, if I could do that quickly. Now, the medieval period is such a misunderstood period. And in our contemporary imagination, it's the Dark Ages very often. And the great scholar Erasmus called medieval theologians and monks whose Latin and Greek wasn't very good. He called them barbarians. And I think some people in the room might agree with that. But so there was this notion that the education, there was unlearned people in the Middle Ages. And the Protestant reformers often categorized the entire medieval church as corrupt and barbaric. So thinkers, and then thinkers of the so-called Age of Enlightenment during the 17th and 18th centuries tended to look down on religion, mocking especially the Middle Ages as a superstitious age. And and these things persist, these misconceptions, I would say. In his 2011 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Swerve, How the World Became Modern, Stephen Greenblatt repeats several of these misconceptions, claiming that medieval people turned away from reading and writing. So don't mention Stephen Greenblatt to medievalists. The word medieval itself is considered pejorative. It is used to describe things thought to be archaic and brutal, conjuring ideas of torture and repression. But every era, I think we would agree, is dark, light, and full of a lot of gray areas. And the Middle Ages was no different. It had good and bad and lots of in between. But because there are so many critics of the Middle Ages, tonight I want to focus mainly on a place of light in the medieval world. And that is the examples of women who were recognized as remarkable teachers and preachers. And just if you are interested in looking at the many misconceptions of the Middle Ages, there's this wonderful book called The Misconceptions About the Middle Ages. Now, despite my focus on the bright spots that I want to look at, I recognize that there are restrictive examples associated with female preaching in the history of medieval Christianity. And I want to acknowledge these very briefly with the purpose of showing that they offer a partial picture of attitudes toward female preaching, but not the complete picture. So here are some restrictive examples. Now, some medieval theologians referred to a clutch of biblical verses to disqualify women from preaching and teaching publicly about religious matters. And these verses, you probably know some of them, include the Pauline text, 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 to 35. Let women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted them to speak, but to be subject, as also the law says. Or there's the famous 1 Timothy 2:12. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to use authority over the man, but to be in silence. Quickly, as an aside, for those of you who are interested in how these particular verses play out in the modern period, in our contemporary world, I do encourage you to come to Beth Allison Barr's talk that will be here in 48 hours. It's the next Chair of Christian Thought talk, and she's going to be looking at the making of biblical womanhood, how the subjugation of women became the gospel truth. Okay, so that's a lecture that follows on very nicely from this one, I think. But getting back to the Middle Ages, there are also sections of medieval canon law, that is ecclesiastical law, that indicated women should not preach in public, and especially not in a pulpit. According to canon law, a woman could only preach if she were an abbess in a convent. So this is what canon law says. Yes, she can preach if she's an abbess privately in the cloister or in chapter or in choir. She is able to teach her nuns and preach to them. But all these things are forbidden to other women, all those things. Okay, so, and there were also influential theologians like Thomas Aquinas, who inherited and adhered to ancient Greco-Roman ideas of biology that perceived women as failed males. When answering the question if women should teach or preach publicly, Thomas Aquinas said, definitely not, and explained why. First and chiefly on account of the condition attached to the sex, to the female sex, whereby women should be subject to man. Okay, so there we are. Therefore, based on some biblical verses, sections of canon law, and a belief in women's natural inferiority to men, some medieval theologians upheld that women should not preach. For them, preaching was a public act carried out by men, normally a priest from a pulpit. Women were not to enter the pulpit. So here is a mid-15th century representation of the ideal male preacher. It's actually of Bernardino of Siena, who was a superstar preacher. I mean, people would follow him around, and he attracted so many people that they often had to have his pulpit set up outside churches. And here you get the sense that here he's preaching to men, women, children, the whole crowd. Now, these examples show that there were strong views that women should not preach. It was a man's job. But these texts are prescriptive and were not indicative of all theological views and pastoral practices. They do not represent the breadth and depth of preaching that occurred in the Middle Ages, because some medieval women did preach and teach in public, in front of women and men. So let me just quickly provide 3 examples to support or demonstrate my claims. And the first, of course, is Hildegard of Bingen, who was a German nun known for great learning and prophetic powers. The image here, the image here actually is of Hildegard writing down in Latin her vision of the cosmos. And she wrote on so many works, and this is a depiction of her writing down how she wrote, seeing things and then writing them down in Latin. The Hildegard, in addition to writing so many different theological works in Latin, she preached in her convent, and she also preached occasionally in cathedrals. Sometimes, so this is public, Okay, this is a public preaching. So sometimes audience members asked Hildegard to send them copies of her sermons. And in 1163, the head priest of Cologne, Dean Philip, wrote, oh, did that go? Yes. For since it is abundantly clear that the Spirit has chosen a dwelling pleasing to himself in your heart, understandably, we come to you in admiration as if to the living temple of God to offer up prayers, and we seek responses of truth from your heart as if from the very oracle of God. We request that you commit to writing and send us those things that you said to us earlier in person. Okay, so that's one example, German example. Here's an Italian example. Angela of Foligno, a devout widow, served as a religious teacher to men and women. And here is a 14th century slide of her book that contained her teachings that she gave to men and women. And it's an image of Angela in prayer here. Now, the Franciscan friar and theologian Ubertino of Casale looked to Angela for answers regarding the inner life of his soul. And there's a very powerful account of an encounter he has with her. And this is what he wrote in response to that encounter. All my own gifts lost through my evilness, she restored beyond measure, so that from then on, I was no longer the person I had been. Through the vigilant brightness of her inflamed virtue, she changed the whole shape of my mind and beat back the infirmities and feebleness from my body and soul, and transformed my prior distractions into more excellent things, so that no one of sound mind who had known me before had a doubt that the Spirit of Christ was begat in me anew. She must have been a pretty good teacher, I think. Again, teaching publicly about religious ideas. Catherine of Siena, devout laywoman. Notice these people aren't all nuns either, right? They're widows, laywomen. Now, she was a guide to two popes, Pope Gregory XI and Urban VI. She gave them advice. And here you have an image of Catherine of Siena at the papal court, giving advice, papal advice to Gregory XI. So this is a pretty strong image, I think. William Fleet, who was an English priest and friend of Catherine, said of her public ministry, in her letters and writings, in her knowledge and teaching, she was not Paul, but Apollo, a teacher of teachers, a pastor of pastors, an abyss of wisdom, an untiring preacher of truth. Okay, so Hildegard was described as having a Holy Spirit dwelling in her, Angela as having Jesus speak through her, and Catherine as possessing a wisdom that was fathomless. Now, these portrayals imply prophetic authority, similar to that found in the biblical books of the major prophets, including Jeremiah, Daniel. These men were perceived to be inspired by God, and their world held their authority in great weight. In the Middle Ages, the idea that holy women had a special capacity to communicate prophetically and challenge the divine voice became widespread. Therefore, so we need to keep this in mind, while some medieval theologians upheld that women should not preach or teach publicly, others understood the voices of Hildegard of Bingen, Angela of Foligno, and Catherine of Siena, just to name a few, as echoes of the prophetic tradition in their own time. Now, these differing views on women's public role indicate that the medieval world was not black or white, but a complex and nuanced culture of different perspectives. Now, for the remainder of my talk, I will focus on two female preachers, Elizabeth of Spalbeek and Juana de la Cruz. And I want to show that by understanding their roles of religious educators, we better understand the diverse terrain of medieval Christianity. And before I talk about Elizabeth, I need to introduce you to the idea of performative preaching. And medieval preaching focused greatly on the gospel narrative per se, and it was the most widespread subject of public religious education in the Middle Ages. The preaching of the gospel in the medieval tradition came to have a very performative element to it. And some preachers presented the life of Christ using dramatic reenactments. And this is called performative preaching, acting out the gospel narrative. And, oops, there we go. Preaching the gospel narrative through performance was popularized by Francis of Assisi. And Francis was one of the most influential preachers in the Middle Ages, although he was not a priest, and nor was he educated as a cleric. His enthusiasm to follow in the footsteps of Jesus and his apostles as an itinerant preacher led to the establishment of the Franciscan order. He is also remembered as being so much like Christ that he miraculously received the stigmata on his body, that is the 5 wounds of the crucifixion. And here is a very early depiction, one of the earliest depictions of Francis of Assisi bearing the stigmata from 1228, 2 years after his death. That is the image. Now, Francis's preaching the gospel account of Jesus's nativity encapsulates his performative preaching. Francis wished to reenact the nativity scene at Bethlehem to underline the belief that the vulnerable newborn in the crib, in the manger, was the savior of the world. He chose, so to get this point across, he found a barn and he got some hay and he had it gathered around and put it in a crib. He got an ox and an ass and he put it around the crib. And then he started to preach. But we're really not told the content too much. I guess we know the story, but we're told that he, with a musical voice in the open air, he licked his lips whenever he said the name Jesus, as if tasting his sweetness. And he constantly referred to Christ as Jesus, the babe of Bethlehem. And when he said the word Bethlehem, he would do so like a bleating sheep. And it is also conjectured that he probably had a doll or a real baby to get this point across even more profoundly, to provoke the presence of the Christ child. So Francis's preaching focused on recreating the nativity through staging and drama to make a powerful sermon. And I want to stress that Francis did this preaching, not from a pulpit or in a church. And as I said earlier, nor was he a priest, but his contemporaries described his preaching of the nativity and other similar performances as preaching, full stop. They identified this as preaching. So performative preaching, similar to Francis's method, found its most astounding examples among women. And this is where Elizabeth Spalbeek comes in. Elizabeth was a devout laywoman associated with the Cistercian monastery in what is now modern-day Belgium. And we know about her performative preaching because an ecclesiastical authority provided a detailed eyewitness account, and his name was Philip, abbot of the renowned Cistercian monastery of Clairvaux. And in 1267, Abbot Philip recorded Elizabeth's method of gospel teaching. When Philip met her, she was 20 years old. At that time, she already had an established reputation as someone who provided religious counsel to men and women. Philip recorded a very short sermon that Elizabeth gave publicly. And here it is. Should all sermons be this short? If you want to study humility, you should go to the school of our sweetest lady, the Virgin Mary, the sweetest mother of our sweetest Lord, Jesus Christ, for she herself is the greatest teacher of humility. Now, The tour de force of Elizabeth's preaching occurred on Fridays when she performed the Passion of Christ in this church that you're looking at. In fact, the church was built purposely for her performances. She did this at 7 intervals during the course of a day, entire day, and the intervals corresponded to the 7 hours of monastic prayer recited in memory of the Passion of Christ. So here we have, just broke it down for you how monks and nuns would have broken down these prayers in memory of the Passion of Christ throughout the day. Matins and lauds would have been probably middle of the night, depending on the time of year, where they would pray on and think about agony in the garden and Christ's betrayal. And then prime would be around 6 a.m., Christ before Pilate. Terce, about 9 a.m., was the flagellation of Christ. Sext would be about noon, Christ carrying the cross. None would be 3 p.m., the crucifixion. Vespers, deposition, compline, entombment. Now, the reason I went through these is because Elizabeth acted all these out through the course of the entire day. And Philip said it was absolutely spellbinding. She played the part of Christ, of course, but she also played other parts of the Passion story. So she would play these multiple players. And she would say short prayers to frame the scenes. And to portray the mocking of Christ, I'll give you an example. She would strike herself repeatedly on the jaw, grasped her clothes, and dragged herself from right to left. And then she acted out the flagellation of Jesus. And here it is. So Philip tells us, she signs and figures how our Lord was bound to a column, joining her arms in front of her chest, putting her fingertips under her elbows, and so joining together her arms in front of her chest, as if to signify the empty space for the column. And so she indicates, as much as she is able, how the column was firmly encircled by our sweetest Lord's arms. So what we have, I've just picked this out. This is an image that's coeval with Elizabeth. She very likely didn't see this image. It's in a manuscript, it's a miniature, but it's a very stylized pose of Christ and the flagellation at the column. And it may suggest and give us some insight, the types of poses that Elizabeth would have been doing in front of her audience, who would have been completely familiar with these types of images, and knowing by just the way she puts her arms or her feet, where they are in the gospel story through this enactment. So Elizabeth's sermon dance is shockingly intense, but Philip validated it as relaying Christian beliefs. He said that the movements of Elizabeth led the audience to fill in the verses of the gospel as they saw it performed before them. So, and this is clear in her enactment of the crucifixion. And this is what he writes, emitting indescribable sobs and moans, almost giving forth her spirit as if dying, she rests her tilting head over her right shoulder, insinuating the gospel verse, quote, and bowing his head, he gave up the ghost. So Elizabeth did enact the crucifixion scene. She tilted her head to the right. All these things captured in this lovely Giotto painting from the early 14th century. Philip saw Elizabeth as a female counterpart to Francis of Assisi. And like Francis, Philip reported that she bore the 5 marks of Christ's stigmata on her body. So he's saying that she's just like Francis to the point that she has stigmata on her body. And Philip observed that Francis in the form of a man and Elizabeth in the form of a woman provided examples so all of humanity, he uses the word humanity, homo, could grasp the meaning of Christ's passion. And then he says, no one, not even the illiterate or simple, can feign ignorance and say, quote, I can't read or understand such profound mysteries as I am unlettered. because now the unlearned can read, not from parchment or charters, but from our Elizabeth's limbs and body, just like a moving picture, an animated narrative of redemption. Now, Elizabeth, like Francis, used a sermon made up of gestures and some words to invoke the divine for her audience and strengthen the faith of her audience. Now, I just want to get into a little bit of medieval theology. So if you just, I won't spend too much time on it, but it's important for us, I think, to understand Elizabeth's place and why Philip's accepting of her as a preacher. Now, Philip's acceptance of Elizabeth as a fitting actor for relaying the gospel and mirroring Christ in her body reflects a theological perspective different from the one that argued women could not teach publicly owing to their natural weaknesses. And let me explain his view in just a bit more detail. Philip, like all medieval theologians, believed that Christ had a wholly divine nature and a wholly human nature. And in the middle of his description of Elizabeth's sermon dance, he addressed this complex tenet of faith because he saw it had significance for Elizabeth's role as a performative preacher. He clarified that being born from a human mother with no human father meant that Christ's flesh was assumed from the Virgin Mary alone. He argues that Mary's flesh was so intertwined with Christ that she became a co-sufferer in his passion. Philip cited the Simeon prophecy to show that there was biblical evidence for Mary's co-suffering. You may ask, what is the Simeon prophecy? Okay, so during the presentation of the infant Jesus at the temple in the New Testament, Mary brings Jesus to the temple. It's also the first time she's out since giving birth to Jesus. Goes to the temple, and an old man named Simeon predicted the crucifixion of Christ and that Mary would suffer with him. Simeon said, or implies, he doesn't say that explicitly, but Simeon said to Mary, "In thy own soul a sword will pierce." Okay, so just to show you too, this is a wonderful image of the Simeon prophecy and the presentation of Jesus at the temple by Bellini. And he captures the Simeon prophecy in the iconography. Mary is at the temple. She's holding baby Jesus in her hands in his swaddling clothes. But that swaddling is exactly like how people would wrap corpses in the Middle Ages. So it's prefiguring the death of Christ. And what we have here is Mary holding the baby Christ, but it's also prefiguring when she's holding the dead Christ after the crucifixion. So it's a lovely way Bellini is able to capture this. But Philip is saying the same thing in his theology. This is what he's making this point. Mary is suffering just like Christ. And Philip explained that when Christ's side was pierced by a lance, Mary painfully felt it too in the same spot. And she suffered not only physically, but emotionally during the crucifixion especially. And here is where Philip starts to expound a theology articulated by some medieval theologians, but not all. He goes on to say that no one should be surprised that by Elizabeth's enactment of the Passion. Elizabeth was a virgin, a quality she shared with the Virgin Mary, the person most closely linked to Christ in mind and body. So Elizabeth with dignity could thus portray Christ's suffering because she resembled Christ in his passion and purity. In his recognition of Elizabeth as a fitting teacher of the gospel, Philip focused on her shared humanity with Christ and showed how that permitted her to tell the gospel narrative of suffering and redemption. Okay, so that's Elizabeth. And now we're going to skip 2 centuries later, and we're going to go to Juana de la Cruz, who was Spanish. She preached publicly She was a Franciscan mystic, abbess, and preacher, and preached publicly in the Castilian village near Toledo, where she preached publicly from 1509 to 1522 in the parish church of Cubas, a Castilian village there. The Franciscan abbess came from a reputable, but by no means aristocratic family, and her role as public preacher was achieved through the support she received from Cardinal Cisneros, who was cardinal, as I say, Grand Inquisitor and Regent of Castile. So he had political roles to play. So he's a big cheese, really. He's one of the most powerful ecclesiastical figures in Spain. And he saw in Juana a person of exceptional ability to bring spiritual renewal to the Catholic Church. And like Francis and Elizabeth, she was marked with the stigmata showing her overt likeness to Christ. So there was claims that she also was marked with the wounds of Christ. Now Cisneros, with backing from the Pope, okay, so the Pope is clued in here, granted Juana the right to fulfill various sacerdotal, that's priestly tasks of the parish priest, including public preaching, right? What she did in the church belonging to her convent. In sum, Cisneros looked to Juana and other holy women as vessels of divine wisdom who could teach all Christians. Now, Juana's preaching was copied down by her convent sisters, who reported that she delivered them while in a trance. They also described Juana as motionless and sometimes even prone when she preached her sermons that lasted 4 hours, and I mean 4 hours, sometimes 5 hours. Juana claimed that her voice was an instrument through which God spoke. She received visions, doctrine, and biblical interpretation straight from heaven. She could see up there, and then she could relay these things. And it's because of this her sermons are described as visionary sermons. Clearly, we see at work here the prevalent belief that holy women had prophetic abilities. But Juana's preaching was also remarkable because it was so public. She preached in a church before varied audiences, including the Emperor Charles V, bishops, and military leaders. Juana's visionary sermons abound with compelling dialogues between Jesus and the Virgin, Mary, the apostles, saints, angels. It's all happening. Because she had this direct line to heaven, she could relay the details of Christ's life that were not contained in the Bible. This is how people perceived it. For example, in her sermon on the Annunciation, Mary and Gabriel engaged in a lengthy conversation. What takes just a few verses in the Gospel of Luke, Juana turns into a protracted exchange between the angel and the virgin. At first, Mary resists Gabriel's message of the virgin birth because she is unsure how her purity will remain intact if she becomes pregnant. And Juana realistically portrays Mary being anxious over this as she considers the unusual situation that she's in. But don't worry, Gabriel eventually convinces her, and we're told immediately Jesus was present in Mary's womb. And then Juana gives this lovely detail about how Jesus feels about his new spot. Okay, and he was very warm and cozy there and did not wish to leave so quickly, and said, speaking to God the Father, "Oh, my powerful Father, I am so happy in such a delightful dwelling. May I dwell in it for a long time, for I would not want to leave this home to be in the world." That's a problem. But and I am very afraid to go out into the cold and tribulations and persecutions, as I am tender and delicate. And this is my precious mother's home, and I find much love and charity and humility and purity. Like Francis's nativity sermon, Juana's sermon on the Incarnation provides a narrative that enables the listener to grasp the profundity and drama of Christ's human and divine natures. In her sermon on the Nativity, the birth and death of Jesus are movingly intertwined. Juana articulates the theological intricacies and implications of Jesus's life and death, which in turn become emotional narratives that engage the audience. She paints a verbal picture of Jesus and the Virgin being gifted by angels with cribs and flowers and golden crowns and garments. And the Virgin, overcome with joy, suckles the baby Jesus, only to be shaken by her reverie by another group of angels who show her the instruments of her son's passion. The Virgin then falls into a state of deep despair and pleads with God not to let her child die a cruel death. Her desperate mood is only broken by the sound of her baby and cooing, which makes her joyous once again. The sermon takes the audience on an emotional journey, inviting feelings of intimacy and happiness, as well as fear and depression. Now, the performativity of her preaching is apparent in her Good Friday sermon. In the Middle Ages, I think as we've seen, Good Friday provided one of the most dramatic preaching moments in the Christian calendar. Juana's sermon shared in this tradition, providing graphic detail of the passion and vivid imagined dialogues of key actors. For instance, she tells us, the Virgin Mary faints as she clings to the cross and is blinded by the blood from Jesus's body that pours into her eyes. At the foot of the cross, John the Evangelist calls out to Mary Magdalene to help. Go. Come here, my sister, help me remove the Virgin Mary from here. We are already losing the Son, who is our God and our Master. Let us not also become orphans by losing the Mother, since she is so sweet and free of sin. And here we have a lovely depiction by Hans Memling of the Virgin who she's just been taken away from the foot of the cross, and Mary Magdalene and John comfort her. So just a taste of Juana's preaching, right? It's kind of wild stuff, really. But I would like to turn to something maybe even more wild, I think, is now to consider ideas of gender in Juana's preaching, as this will help us better understand her role as public teacher. Now, as we have seen with the example of Philip writing about Elizabeth, medieval views of gender were nuanced and imaginative. Christ's divinity as God and human, with a male body wrapped with virginal female flesh, invited some to think deeply about what people's humanity meant in relation to their own identity. Juana's preaching on the massacre of the innocents dramatically captures this medieval sensitivity. This is a depiction of the massacre of the innocents by Giotto in the fabulous Arena Chapel. If you've never been to the Arena Chapel in Padua, you should go immediately. It's one of the great works of medieval art. In this sermon, Jesus talks to the soul of baby girls mistakenly slaughtered. This is not in the Bible. Juana is creating this scenario. Mistakenly slaughtered during the massacre when their murderers mistook them for little boys. Identifying with their suffering and having compassion for them, Jesus tells them, I too am a girl, because I am the child of a woman. Now, Juana's use of this type of dialogue certainly must have caught the attention of her audience. I know I thought it quite remarkable when I saw this. And Juana's own self-understanding of her gender is remarkable too. We learn about it from her autobiography. Juana claimed that she was originally conceived as male and then changed in the womb to female, right? So who says the medieval world is boring? The change occurred when the Virgin Mary in heaven foresaw that Juana would one day be needed to help reform a female religious community. And this could only be done if she were a woman, because a man would not be able to be permitted to live among the community of nuns. There's logic in there. So this is what the autobiography, the biography says. And Blessed Juana de la Cruz was at that moment in the belly of her mother in the process of becoming male. God turned her into a woman, as he could, since he's all-powerful. And his divine majesty refused to take away an Adam's apple that she had in her throat so that it might bear witness to this miracle. Now, perhaps this episode served to validate and rationalize Juana's position as a parish priest, a role normally associated with men, or perhaps Juana's fluctuating gender was a way to underline her likeness to Christ. After all, Christ could be at once a girl and a man. And Juana, too, although a woman, had the mark of a man in the form of an Adam's apple. And of course, let us not forget, she was also believed to have the 5 wounds of Christ. Whatever our interpretation of these accounts, it points to the complexity of identity in the Middle Ages. So, in conclusion, differing and conflicting attitudes about female preaching existed in the Middle Ages. Those who did not approve of women preaching in public had a tendency to adhere strictly to biblical verses that implied women were subordinate to men by nature. On the other hand, those who did approve did not base their position on particular biblical quotes. They tended to be more interested in if a person could relay the overarching story of redemption of the gospel, regardless if they were male or female. Medieval people were not locked into one single way of teaching their beliefs and practices. Whether through the enactment of dance or through the imagination of storytelling, the preaching of these 2 women created opportunities to express diverse ways of ensuring medieval people understood the implications of their faith. Elizabeth and Juana dedicated themselves to teaching the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It was their personal presentations of the gospel that marked them out as unique preachers. Apparently, they nor their supporters perceived 1 Corinthians 14:34 or 1 Timothy 2:12 as applicable to them. Rather, in the case of the women preachers I have discussed this evening, acceptance of their public teaching about faith was not based on gender per se. It was their likeness to Christ's inclusive humanity that validated their positions and allowed for the possibility of imaginative preaching. Thanks. If you're interested in any of the works I refer to, there's a select bibliography there, so sorry.
So we do have time for questions, but there will be a reception following, but we have time for questions right now. And if people online have questions, they can put them in the chat or something like that. I'll just start though. You presented a really interesting variety of women, both geographically, but also in terms of their background. You said there are lots of women who preach. Was there a typical kind of woman who preached? I mean, there seems to be great variety, but were they mostly, for example, aristocratic women in convents, or was it just as varied?
Yeah.
In terms of numbers, as you've suggested.
Yeah. I mean, I think there were maybe not a lot of women who preached. There were several, dozens, hundreds, maybe. Okay, hundreds. But there's such a variety of preaching. So, like someone like Juana wasn't particularly well educated to begin with, but then seemed to develop an excellent training. So their backgrounds could be quite varied. Some were, like Hildegard was trained in Latin, whereas Angela Foligno didn't. She spoke in the vernacular. So it was quite varied who these women who could preach and who couldn't. Although having said that, there's a lot of consistency if we look at convent preaching. So preaching within a cloister, that I would say would be fairly widespread. And very often those types of women came from more privileged backgrounds.
Yeah. Are there other questions?
But thank you. First of all, thank you so much for such a great talk. And thank you so much for dispelling some of those misconceptions about the Middle Ages. We need a lot of that. So my question for you is, how important do you think it was for all of the success of these women preachers that you have, in a sense, described beautifully here, the validation that was given by men? Because one of the things that's interesting is, Catherine of Siena had Ramon of Capua, and Elizabeth Spelbeck had Philip of Clairvaux, and Angela da Foligno, and you see, so they're always, they have men who are validating them, and therefore that's how their success is allowed. So how important it is, what do you think?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. These men are validating their positions. But I think that validation, again, proves the variety, because there's other men who aren't happy about this. They work together, these men and women, with a purpose that they agreed upon about who should be able to teach in this way. And so absolutely no doubt, if they didn't have the support of the men, it would probably be impossible for them to fulfill their desire to be public preachers. But I think the thing to keep in mind is that these men agreed about their roles. People like Philip, people like Ubertino, Raymond, as you say, as for every woman preacher, we have to think there's a good man behind her. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a question from online. It starts with some praise.
Yeah.
What an amazing talk. I'm especially curious about performative preaching. What are some of the ways people who encountered women like Elizabeth, for example, described her speech? Did they call it preaching?
Yeah, that's a good question. Not necessarily. Philip doesn't. This is why I made the point about when Francis does it, it's called preaching. Very same paradigms. When Elizabeth does it, it's called exhortation, which is I guess a more refined, a gentler, or I guess softer way of saying she is engaging in public discourse, but we're not going to call it preaching because of those canon law things I talked about earlier. The term preaching is not used explicitly. Exhortation is, which is considered a form of preaching that does not expound theology explicitly. Juana, on the other hand, though, her preaching is called preaching, and she was given dispensation to do that. And I guess you could argue to a certain degree, Juana's preaching was performative as well. But by and large, and there are a number of performative female preachers. I would say they're preaching because they're doing exactly the same thing Francis is doing. But the terminology, I think the people that are reporting their performative enactments don't want to get these women in trouble possibly, and avoid the term and use exhortation more usually.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is this type of performative preaching common in other areas during that time, or was it specific to kind of gospel preaching or religious preaching? And what exactly made it come out of vogue? Because this is clearly not the way, people preach now.
Too bad, right? It's first of all, it did occur in different areas. So I gave you the example of Elizabeth, which is, northern, Belgium, so Northern Europe would be considered. There are several examples in Italy, in the Italian peninsula. And then there are examples in Spain as well. I don't really know of any examples I only know one little example in England, but I can't really think of that as a trend there. But the thing I think is important is that the New Testament story was the Bible teaching that people were really interested in, and they responded to these performances very profoundly. It was a big event when these things happened. They would write down who was there. They would make descriptions. Thankfully, Philip wrote all this down for us, so we know the detail of it. His is the most detailed account, but it's widespread, and it's based on the sensibilities of the religious culture of the time, which was very interested in the humanity of Christ, and the Jesus of Nazareth, very interested in his life, what happened on a daily basis. This was a curiosity that medieval people really, really wanted to know about. So I think that's part of the reason why it was so popular as well.
So this question is about earlier examples. Of the earliest preacher that you mentioned was Hildegard of Bingen from the late 11th century. Do we find many examples of women preachers in the Christian tradition in the earlier parts of the medieval period? Or is there a distinct separation from women in the ancient world, such as the Desert Mothers? I hope you'll be able to explain for us who the Desert Mothers are.
The Desert Mothers really date to about the 3rd and 4th centuries, and that would be in the desert of Egypt and that part of the world. Now, I do get asked this question sometimes, and I always say, well, I'm looking at the 12th to the 16th century, but I can only think of a handful of early, yes, there were in England. This is where it flips. This is where you start to see a lot more examples of women preaching in England. Very powerful abbesses who were wealthy landowners did preach in the 7th and 8th century. And there's some examples of Merovingian princesses that would preach too, but I haven't worked on that very closely. It's a good topic that somebody should pursue.
Right here, Tom.
Go first.
There's one for the room and please.
Thank you. Amazing lecture, and I'm so sad I won't be able to take a class with you anytime soon. So you kind of talked about the men who were supporting these women, especially, you know, the big names, as the popes with Catherine of Siena. But who were the ones that critiqued them? And where did these critiques come from? Like, were there people who came at these women for pretending, or, you know, for a lack of theology in their preaching? What kind of criticisms did they receive?
Yeah. Yes, well, a lot of the criticism came from the very well trained theologians, and you see the real professionalization of theology in the 13th century with the development of the University of Paris. The establishment of the University of Paris was the place to go where the best theologians went. And I think they were rather protective of their turf, you know, and who could preach. And so 13th century theologians really start to embed a very limited, restrictive definition of what preaching is. It's public. It's usually in a pulpit. It's done by a priest. And that's what theologians start to say very often in the 13th century. So I think these are the critics, are the very well-trained theologians who probably felt people like Elizabeth wasn't, you know, they couldn't, I don't think they could, their sensibilities were the same. I think they thought that this was very basic, and why is she doing this? But someone like Philip could see the great worth, as he says in that statement. I think he's defending why she's doing it, that not everybody can read, not everybody gets our religion. There has to be different ways to relay it. So there was a struggle there. The dominant voice that comes down to us are theologians like Thomas Aquinas, and they were very critical of this sort of activity. But as we see, once we start to scratch the surface, perhaps they were so critical of it because it was going on. It wasn't theoretical, it was really happening.
Question up here.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on that question about earlier and also talk about later. You had lots of Giotto up there. I mean, you really are heavy on the late Middle Ages, and I'm wondering if there's something kind of zeitgeist-like going on here with sort of the kind of ferment that's characteristic of late medieval, early Renaissance. So, you know, one part of the question repeating the online one is, was there less before and was there a kind of efflorescence? And the other is what happens after the Reformation? Does it go down again? I mean, there's
I just missed the last bit of
what
that.
happens after the Reformation? I mean,
Mhm.
there's all sorts of Reformation tropes that would
Yeah.
seem to be death to all this sort of stuff. So does
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. Well, the history of itinerant preaching really takes off in Western Europe in around the 11th century. So this is where you start to see a sea change in preaching becoming a very exciting, unpredictable, creative way to relay information about the New Testament. And we see this again in northern France. That's where things start to change. And it's usually the monks who are coming out of their cloisters to do this. And this is where we start to see a change. And they start to gather huge followings. But I can't really think of women who were doing it. It was the monks that were doing it then. But I think it caught fire. And Francis of Assisi actually is influenced by this whole, what is called the New Testament revival from the 12th century on. And so Francis is inspired of that. And then we see these women really, getting on board with this type of, I would say, more public preaching. As I said earlier, the preaching within a convent, I would say, is something that shouldn't be surprising. It did happen. But the people coming out of the convents or people who are just lay people, that really starts to occur from the 12th century onwards. And I think that's why I'm looking at that period too. And just to answer your question about, what happens after the Reformation, I take my study up until when the Reformation actually is starting. And so I'm looking at a few women who actually preached against Luther. So, but that's where I'm going to stop, because we could keep going on. But so there are women in the Catholic tradition who preach against what Luther's teaching. And that's really what starts to happen. There's some amazing examples of that in Italy and Germany, of women taking Martin Luther to task.
Yes, thanks very much. I'm struck by the fact that the examples you gave, many of them were mystics and had this direct experience. And so I'm wondering whether one could say that in the time period you're looking at, if you were a female public preacher, you basically had to be a mystic. And that's probably not the high bar that other preachers, namely male preachers, would have had to make. I'm just curious if there is a commonality there that the female preachers were generally in this kind of contemplative, mystical vein.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think what we see here is a type of vocabulary and the way when women perform or preach, there's a certain set of terms, certain set of a context usually that they miraculously learned how to write or read. All these things are tied to the preaching woman. I think we need to accept that this is the cultural discourse or shorthand for these women, or I can say these women are preachers, but this is the way you have to talk about that. So I think some of the women I'm looking at, some of them are more mystical than others, but some of that language is always applied to these women because it's that notion of the prophetic authority. It gets around any sticky points of canon law or what the Bible might say, because here this is prophetic authority that is biblical, that is above the law, as it were. So it's not that they had to be mystic sometimes, but that's how they were described in order to succeed, and that's how their supporters would describe them very often.
Okay, we're gonna give one last
Yeah,
question to the internet.
Okay.
Had a lot of questions there.
Mhm.
So this final question is about an English preacher or an English person, Marjorie Kemp.
Yes.
And so again, thank you for the marvelous talk. Oops, it's just vanished here. I could, while you were speaking, I couldn't help but think about Marjorie Kemp, who did not garner the respect that others did. Her performative preaching was really so similar. Did Elizabeth, for example, have the support of important men before she began her public preaching dancing? Why would Marjorie fail where Elizabeth succeeded?
Yeah.
Well, that's a bit speculative.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just a quick yes about Elizabeth. Her uncle was a Cistercian monk. And I think he's the one who had the church built for her so she could perform. So she had serious support, family support as well. So so that's important too, is that there's, when we think about these cultures, it's not just these rules that are written in black and white. There's families, there's practices that really shape what people do and what they believe. So she had backing. Thank you for reminding me of Marjorie. Yeah, Marjorie was very she was a 15th century English woman. She was married. She had 14 kids. She used to make beer, and she's quite interesting. But she used to go on pilgrimage, and she used to tell people publicly about what is right and wrong in religion. And she was accused of being a heretic and preaching, but she was a very clever woman. So she did all these things and said all these things. But she said to those who claimed that she was preaching, I see no pulpit. There's no pulpit around me. I'm not in a pulpit. I don't preach. And so she was able to use the law to show how she is not fitting into the restrictions that they say that if you're a woman, you're not to go in the pulpit. She said, I never stepped into a pulpit. And she wins that argument. And the Archbishop of Canterbury says, fine, you're okay, no problem. So, yeah, no, that's a good example of a English performative preacher. Yeah.
So there's always a way around the rules.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
as I've said, we will be having a reception afterwards so that people can ask questions more informally to our speaker. I did want to thank once again the John and Naomi Lacey Foundation for the Arts, and for all the people who helped to make tonight's events possible. So John McBurney and Graham Smart, the events coordinators here at the fantastic Calgary Public Library, a civic treasure. Thanks to Madia Chowdhury and Shannon Katusa from the Faculty of Arts Development team who checked everybody in. Thanks to you Calgary alumni who supported the tech and things like that. And finally, thanks to my colleague Sean Lindsay, the CIH coordinator, for making all of this happen. But most of all, please join me in thanking Dr. Carolyn Muessig for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.